On Christmas Day, my parents handed out keys to miniature luxury cars and brand new expensive tablets to my nieces and nephews. When my own children reached out their small hands, my mother looked them in the eye and smirked. "We only buy gifts for the grandkids who actually make us proud," she announced to the whole room. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply packed up my children, walked out the door, and set a trap that would cost them every penny they ever owned. I am Rachel, 33 years old, and a forensic accountant who specializes in tracking hidden assets. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your children from toxic relatives, because the gift I gave my parents in return changed our family forever. The living room of my parents' sprawling suburban estate looked like a holiday magazine cover. A massive 12-foot Christmas tree stood in the center of the room, dripping with crystal ornaments and silver ribbons. My sister Amanda and her husband Jamal sat comfortably on the white leather sofa, sipping expensive champagne. Their 3 children were tearing through mountains of shiny wrapping paper. Gasps of delight filled the room as they uncovered their loot. There were brand new tablets, designer clothes, and even motorized miniature cars that cost more than most people make in a month. Sitting quietly on the floor by the fireplace were my 7-year-old son Leo and my 5-year-old daughter Mia. They had been waiting patiently for their names to be called. As the pile of gifts under the tree dwindled to nothing, Leo looked up at me with confused eyes. His little hands were completely empty. Mia hugged her knees, trying to make herself look small. I felt a tight knot form in my chest. I looked over at my husband David. He was standing by the doorway, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. He stepped forward to say something, but my mother Patricia beat him to it. She stood up, smoothing down her designer holiday dress, and projected her voice over the festive music playing in the background. She made sure everyone in the room was listening. "I saw your children looking at the tree, Rachel," she said with a cold smile. "But we only bought gifts for the grandkids who make us proud this year. Mediocrity should never be rewarded." The room went dead silent. Even the sound of the wrapping paper stopped. Amanda let out a soft giggle and took another sip of her drink. My mother continued, pointing a manicured finger at my son. "Look at Amanda's children. They are thriving at their private academy. Richard and I are more than happy to pay the $40,000 tuition for kids who actually excel. But your Leo is still struggling to read basic sentences. I am not going to reward a child who has to be put in special education classes because he is falling behind." She was weaponizing my son's mild dyslexia, a condition he was working so hard to overcome, with a tutor just to elevate her golden child's family. She knew Leo was making incredible progress. She also knew that Amanda's kids only got passing grades because my father constantly made large donations to their private school. Jamal let out a loud laugh that echoed against the vaulted ceiling. He swirled the premium bourbon in his glass and shook his head. "Come on now, Rachel," Jamal mocked. "Do not be upset with your mother for speaking the truth. If your husband made a real salary instead of wiping noses at the pediatric clinic, maybe you could afford to buy your kids their own presents. It is not our fault you chose a glorified bedpan cleaner for a partner. Being poor means you have to swallow your pride sometimes. Just accept it." He leaned back on the sofa, looking incredibly smug in his tailored suit. He loved rubbing his supposed wealth in our faces. Jamal constantly bragged about the crypto investment fund he founded, acting like he was the smartest man in any room. My father Richard finally walked into the living room holding a fresh plate of appetizers. He did not reprimand Jamal or my mother. Instead, he looked at me with immense disappointment. "Stop causing drama on Christmas, Rachel," my father commanded. "Your mother has a point. You need to push your children to be better instead of coddling their failures. Now sit down and enjoy the holiday." I looked at the smug faces of my parents and my sister. Then I looked at my 2 crying children. Jamal took another slow sip of his aged bourbon. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, making the ice clink loudly in the quiet room. "You know, David, Jamal said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I actually feel sorry for you, man. You work 50 hours a week doing the grunt work that actual doctors do not want to do. You are a glorified bedpan cleaner. How does it feel knowing you cannot even buy your own son a plastic toy for Christmas? You should have gone into finance like me." My new crypto investment firm closed a major funding round last week. We are talking 8 figures easily. I just bought Amanda a diamond tennis bracelet that costs more than your entire annual salary. It is all about knowing how to hustle, something a public sector nurse simply does not understand. David tightened his iron grip on the wooden door frame. I could clearly see the blue veins standing out on his forearms. He spent his long days comforting terrified families in the pediatric intensive care unit. He saved the fragile lives of premature infants and held the trembling hands of grieving parents. His hard work had more genuine meaning in a single afternoon than Jamal's entire pathetic existence. But David was a good and gentle man. He would never start a physical brawl in front of our young children on Christmas morning. He looked at me, his dark eyes silently asking for permission to unleash his anger. I gave him a barely perceptible shake of my head. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum or try to argue. Arguing with narcissists is like pouring water into a bottomless pit. It only drains your own precious energy. Instead, I knelt down on the plush white rug. I gently wiped a warm tear from Mia's soft cheek with my thumb. "Come on, sweetie," I whispered softly. "We are going home right now." I stood up and took Leo's trembling hand in mine. He looked up at me, his lower lip quivering slightly. "It is okay, Leo," I said, my voice steady and calm. "Santa left your real presents at our house. These were just the silly warm-up gifts." I guided my children away from the living room and toward the front hallway. I reached into the coat closet and pulled out our winter jackets. I helped Mia slip her tiny arms into her pink puffer coat and zipped it up to her chin. I handed Leo his blue jacket and warm scarf. David stood right beside us, forming a solid protective wall between our children and my toxic family. He helped me put on my wool coat before pulling on his own. "My mother?" Patricia scoffed loudly from the leather sofa. "Oh, do not be so incredibly dramatic, Rachel," she yelled across the room. "You are acting exactly like a spoiled child. We are simply trying to teach your kids a valuable lesson about the real competitive world. If you walk out that door right now, you are disrespecting this entire family." I ignored her completely. I wrapped my thick scarf around my neck and picked up my purse. My father, Richard, suddenly stomped into the hallway, blocking the front door. His face was turning a deep shade of furious crimson. "Where do you think you are going?" he demanded loudly. "We have an expensive catered prime rib dinner arriving in exactly 20 minutes. I paid top dollar for a professional photographer to come take family portraits by the tree. If you leave now, you are completely ruining the aesthetic of the holiday. Amanda will not have a perfect picture for her thousands of social media followers." I looked my father dead in the eye. My gaze was empty of the desperate need for his approval that used to control my life. "The aesthetic of this holiday was ruined the moment you decided to maliciously abuse a 7-year-old boy," I said evenly. "Move out of the way, Richard." I had stopped calling him Dad many years ago. He blinked in utter shock at the sudden use of his first name. For a tense second, I really thought he might refuse to move, but David immediately stepped forward, pulling his broad shoulders back and standing at his full height. My husband was a solid 6'2" and built like a wall. Richard was a soft man who had never fought a single day in his entire privileged life. My father quickly took a cowardly step back, pressing himself against the expensive hallway wallpaper. I firmly turned the brass knob and opened the heavy oak door, letting a blast of freezing winter air hit my face. I squeezed David's hand tightly. We walked out into the cold, leaving the fake perfect family sitting alone in their perfect house of lies. The freezing winter wind whipped against us as we hurried down the driveway toward our car. The contrast between the biting cold and the artificial warmth of my parents' mansion felt refreshing. David quickly unlocked the heavy car doors and helped me buckle Leo and Mia into their car seats. The kids were far too quiet in the back of the car. I leaned over the center console and handed them each a small candy cane I had tucked into my purse earlier. "We are going to go home and watch your favorite holiday movies," I promised them with a smile. "And tomorrow morning we are making double chocolate pancakes." That brought a tiny smile to Leo's face. David started the engine and turned the heater on high. He kept his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead, his jaw still tense. I pulled my phone out of my coat pocket. My hands were shaking slightly from pure adrenaline. I opened the family group chat. The last message was a picture Amanda had sent an hour ago showing off her ridiculous tennis bracelet. I tapped the screen and typed my message quickly. "Do not invite us again. We are not your joke. Your gift is on the way." I hit send and tossed the phone into the cup holder. Almost instantly, the dark interior of our car lit up. My phone started vibrating violently against the plastic console. It was a relentless barrage of notifications. Amanda sent a string of angry text messages calling me insane and jealous. Patricia called twice and hung up. Then came the phone call from my father. I watched his name flash across the screen until it rolled to voicemail. A minute later, the notification chimed, indicating a new audio message. David glanced at the phone and then back at the road. "Are you going to listen to it?" he asked quietly. I pressed the speaker button so we could hear it loud and clear. My father's voice filled the small car, dripping with venom. "Rachel, you ungrateful brat!" his recorded voice spat. "How dare you walk out on this family and ruin our holiday? If you do not turn that car around right now and come back to apologize, I am cutting you out of the will. You will not see a single dime of my estate. Your entire life will amount to nothing without my name backing you. Do not test me." The voicemail ended with a loud click. Silence fell over the car again. For a brief second, David looked genuinely worried. He knew how vindictive my father could be. But then something broke inside me. A sudden, uncontrollable laugh bubbled up from my chest. It started as a soft chuckle and quickly turned into full-blown laughter. I laughed so hard my eyes watered. David looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. "Rachel, are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed in concern. I wiped a tear from my eye and took a deep breath. "I am perfectly fine, David," I said, leaning back against the passenger seat. "In fact, I have never been better. Let him cut me out of his precious will. It does not matter anyway." David looked thoroughly confused. "What do you mean it does not matter?" he asked, keeping his hand steady on the wheel. I turned to look at my husband. "David, my parents are completely broke," I stated flatly. "The mansion, the expensive cars, the country club memberships, it is all a massive illusion built on a mountain of high-interest debt." David blinked rapidly, processing this shocking information. "But how do you know that?" he asked. "Richard is always bragging about his vast stock portfolio." I let out another dry laugh. "Because I am a forensic accountant," I reminded him. "I spend 40 hours a week tracking hidden assets and exposing financial fraud for large corporations. Did you really think I would not notice the glaring red flags in my own family? A few months ago, I accidentally saw a bank statement my father left on his desk. It showed multiple maxed-out credit lines and a massive second mortgage on the house. They are drowning in debt, David. That expensive tuition they bragged about paying for Amanda's kids. It was paid using a high-interest personal loan. And that supposed crypto fund Jamal is running. I have been quietly looking into that too. There is no legitimate funding round. Jamal is simply running a desperate scam to keep his own lavish lifestyle afloat. My parents are foolish enough to be tied up in his illegal mess. They are going to lose absolutely everything they own very soon. And tonight I set the final trap that will expose them all." The drive back to our quiet neighborhood felt much shorter than usual. The moment we walked through the front door of our modest 3-bedroom house, I felt the heavy tension finally begin to drain from my shoulders. David gently carried a sleepy Mia upstairs while I walked Leo to his bedroom. I tucked the heavy winter quilt around him and kissed his forehead, promising him again that tomorrow morning would be filled with warm chocolate pancakes and his real holiday gifts. After making absolutely sure both kids were fast asleep, I walked down the hall to my home office. It was a small room, but it was my private sanctuary away from the chaos. I locked the wooden door behind me and turned on the small brass desk lamp. I poured myself a glass of cold water and sat down in my ergonomic chair. I opened my heavy-duty work laptop. It was time to go to work and uncover the truth. As a senior forensic accountant for a major corporate firm, I had authorized access to several high-level financial databases. I plugged in my encrypted security key and typed in my complex passwords. The screen blinked green, granting me immediate access to the Federal Business Registry networks. I pulled out a small notepad where I had scribbled down the tax identification number for Jamal's supposed crypto investment firm. He had proudly plastered the company name all over his public social media profiles, making it incredibly easy for anyone to track. I typed the 9-digit federal tax number into the secure search bar and pressed enter. The system chewed on the data for a few seconds before pulling up the primary corporate filings. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the dense columns of legal jargon and financial disclosures. Almost immediately, the glaring red flags began popping up everywhere. Jamal did not just have one legitimate company. He had a tangled web of 7 different limited liability companies, all registered to a single empty mail drop address in Delaware. This is a classic structuring technique often used to obscure the movement of illicit funds. But what really made my heart hammer against my ribs was the debt-to-asset ratio on the main ledger. There was absolutely no venture capital funding flowing into his accounts. There were no massive 8-figure investments from wealthy tech billionaires. Instead, his entire fake operation was being propped up by a staggering $5 million commercial loan from a private offshore bank. I traced the origin of the massive loan through the banking network. Banks do not just hand $5 million to a guy with a fake crypto portfolio without securing serious collateral. I clicked through the attached digital security agreements and felt a cold chill wash over my entire body. The primary collateral for Jamal's reckless loan was my parents' sprawling suburban estate. Richard and Patricia had legally signed away their beautiful house, their expensive cars, and every liquid asset they possessed to guarantee Jamal's massive debt. They had essentially bet their entire financial existence on a fast-talking con artist who was clearly bleeding them dry. I shook my head in utter disbelief. My father always thought he was the smartest financial investor in the room. Now he was fully legally bound to a sinking ship. But the deeper I dug into the complex loan documents, the more a strange sense of unease settled in my stomach. The strict collateral requirements for a high-risk commercial loan of that magnitude demanded far more than just a heavily mortgaged suburban house. The bank required a secondary tier of guaranteed liquid assets. I scrolled down to the final page of the digital loan agreement, frantically searching for the secondary guarantor. My eyes landed on the legal establishment of a blind trust. I frowned, leaning in until my nose almost touched the glowing screen. The trust was newly formed, specifically holding a highly valuable piece of commercial real estate that my grandfather had purchased decades ago. But that property was legally supposed to be protected from my parents. I rapidly pulled up the final signature page of the trust agreement. My breath completely caught in my throat. Staring back at me in stark black and white was my own name, Rachel, listed as the primary guarantor. Right next to my printed name was my signature authorizing the encumbrance of the property to secure Jamal's fraudulent loan. My blood ran completely cold. I had never seen this document before in my entire life. I had never signed away my grandfather's property. Someone in my family had committed federal identity theft. I grabbed my phone to call David. The war had officially begun, and I was going to destroy them all. The next morning, the smell of double chocolate pancakes filled our kitchen. I flipped them just as promised. The kids ate happily while David poured coffee. Despite last night's horrifying discoveries, I wanted a perfect Christmas morning. Then David's phone buzzed loudly. His face instantly turned pale. He looked at me with wide eyes. I turned off the burner. "What is it, David?" I asked. He slid his phone across the granite island. "You need to see this," he whispered. It was an Instagram notification. Amanda had just posted a new video to her 50,000 followers. I tapped play. There was my sister sitting on her expensive white sofa wearing minimal makeup to look genuinely distressed. She wiped away fake tears with a tissue. "Hey guys." Amanda sniffled directly into the camera. "I usually only share positive lifestyle content, but I need to be vulnerable today. My family experienced a horrifying trauma yesterday. My sister Rachel had a complete psychotic break during our Christmas celebration. She started screaming in front of the children, and then she actually tried to steal my mother's expensive vintage jewelry before running out of the house. We are all just so devastated and incredibly worried for her mental health." The video already had thousands of views and hundreds of supportive comments. People praised her bravery and called me a monster. Some even suggested calling the police. I handed the phone back to David. A cold wave of disgust washed over me. Amanda was using my sudden departure to farm online engagement and play the victim for brand deals. As if on cue, my own phone began vibrating incessantly in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and saw a flood of toxic messages from our extended family. My phone was blowing up with pure hatred. Aunt Susan texted to call me a disgraceful thief who belonged in a locked psychiatric ward. Cousin Mark told me I was dead to him and demanded I immediately return the vintage jewelry I never touched. My inbox rapidly filled with poison from distant relatives who had not bothered to speak to me in years. They believed Amanda's theatrical performance without a second thought. They always did. The golden child could do no wrong, and the family scapegoat was always the designated villain. David gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, his knuckles turning completely white. "This has crossed a massive legal line, Rachel," he said, his voice shaking with intense anger. "She is publicly defaming you to tens of thousands of people online. She is accusing you of a literal crime. I am calling my old college roommate right now. He is a senior partner at an aggressive civil litigation firm downtown. We are getting a top-tier defamation lawyer, and we are going to sue her for every penny she has ever made. We need to send a formal cease and desist letter today before this ruins your accounting career." David was fiercely protective, and seeing my reputation dragged through the public mud pushed him over the edge. He picked up his phone ready to make the call. I reached across the kitchen counter and gently placed my hand over his. "Wait, David," I said softly. "Do not call anyone." He looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Wait," he repeated in disbelief. "Rachel, she is destroying your reputation. You cannot let her get away with this lie." I took a sip of coffee and let out a breath. "I am not letting her get away with anything," I explained. "But you never interrupt your enemy when they are making a massive mistake on camera." David frowned, lowering his phone. "What exactly do you mean?" he asked. I looked back at the glowing screen where Amanda's fake crying face was frozen on a loop. "Amanda thinks she is controlling the narrative," I told him. "But she just publicly documented her exact state of mind and location for the federal authorities. She proudly attached her brand to a family she knows is deeply involved in Jamal's fraudulent financial web. When federal investigators look into my whistleblower report, they will immediately see this video. They will see her blatantly lying about a fake theft to cover up the fact that I left because I discovered their loan fraud. She is giving the government free, undeniable evidence of her deceptive character. A civil defamation suit would only tip them off that we are fighting back. I want them to feel safe and untouchable. I want them to keep posting their expensive purchases and fake stories. Every video she arrogantly uploads is another solid nail in her own coffin." David slowly nodded, a proud smile breaking through his anger. We were going to let them dig their own graves. 2 days passed in a tense quiet. David and I went about our usual routines. I dropped the kids off at school and spent my days finalizing the whistleblower report. I needed absolute concrete proof before submitting anything to the IRS. I was running out to pick up a few extra groceries for dinner when the quiet finally broke. I was standing in the produce aisle of our local Whole Foods, carefully examining a display of organic avocados. The store was busy with the usual evening rush of people grabbing last-minute ingredients. I reached for a perfectly ripe avocado when someone aggressively shoved their shopping cart into the back of my legs. I stumbled forward, dropping the avocado. It rolled under a display table. I turned around, ready to snap at the careless shopper. My mother, Patricia, stood there gripping the handle of her cart so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked completely unhinged. Her usually perfect hair was slightly messy, and her designer coat looked like it had been thrown on in a rush. She glared at me, her chest heaving with dramatic indignation. "I have been calling you for 2 days, Rachel," she hissed loudly enough for the woman examining apples nearby to turn and stare. "Why are you ignoring me?" I calmly reached down and picked up my purse, which had slipped from my shoulder. "Because I have nothing left to say to you, Patricia," I replied, keeping my voice low and steady. "Now please move your cart so I can finish my shopping." She did not move an inch. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes blazing with furious entitlement. "You are going to apologize to your sister right now," she demanded, poking a rigid finger at my chest. "Do you have any idea how much stress you have caused her? She has been crying for 2 days straight. Her followers are so worried about her. You ruined her holiday, and you embarrassed this family. You need to issue a public apology on your own social media explaining that you were having a mental health crisis." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Are you completely out of your mind?" I asked, not bothering to keep my voice down anymore. "I am not apologizing to Amanda for walking away from her abuse. And I am certainly not playing into her pathetic victim narrative so she can get more sympathy likes." Patricia's face flushed an ugly shade of red. "How dare you speak about your sister that way?" she yelled, spittle flying from her lips. "She is the only one in this family actually making something of herself. She is building a real brand while you just crunch boring numbers all day in a tiny cubicle. You have always been so bitterly jealous of her. That is why you acted like a complete lunatic at Christmas. You could not stand seeing her beautiful family so happy and successful." The sheer audacity of her delusions snapped the last thin thread of my patience. The years of swallowing her blatant favoritism bubbled up like acid in my throat. I took a step toward her, closing the distance between us. "I am not jealous of a woman who has to fake her entire life on the internet, Patricia." I fired back, my voice ringing clear through the produce section. "And I am definitely not jealous of a family that relies on stealing from their own children to fund their fake luxury. I am not 18 anymore, Mom. You cannot secretly drain my college scholarship fund to pay for Amanda's nose job and designer graduation dress and expect me to just stay quiet and take it. You cannot steal my future to buy her a better face. Not anymore." The memory of finding my bank account entirely empty right before my freshman year of college hung heavy in the air between us. She had forged my signature back then, too, claiming she needed to borrow the money for a family emergency. That emergency turned out to be Amanda's sudden desire for cosmetic surgery. Patricia gasped, her eyes darting around frantically to see if anyone had heard my loud accusation. Several shoppers were openly staring now, whispering to each other. The embarrassment of being publicly exposed pushed her over the edge. "You ungrateful little," she shrieked, raising her right hand high in the air. Before I could even react, her palm connected hard with my left cheek. The sharp cracking sound echoed loudly through the entire fresh produce aisle. A woman nearby gasped in shock. My cheek burned with sudden intense heat. I slowly turned my head back to look at her. Patricia stood there panting, looking momentarily triumphant. She thought physical violence would still terrify me into submission like it did when I was a teenager. She was dead wrong. I did not raise my voice. I did not touch my burning cheek. I simply raised my index finger and pointed straight up toward the ceiling. Patricia followed my finger with her eyes. Perched right above the organic apple display, a sleek black security camera was pointed directly down at us. It was recording every single second in crisp, high-definition video. Her triumphant smirk instantly vanished, replaced by stark white panic. I lowered my hand, picked up my dropped avocado, and placed it back on the pile. "Have a wonderful evening, Patricia," I said calmly. I turned my back on her and walked toward the checkout registers, leaving her frozen in absolute terror beneath the blinking red light of the security camera. I did not bother pressing charges for the slap. An assault charge would only result in a minor misdemeanor. I was aiming for federal prison time. When I returned home, David was helping the kids with a puzzle in the living room. I kissed his cheek and headed straight back to my home office. I locked the wooden door and opened my laptop. The encounter at the grocery store only fueled my drive. I needed to finish tracing every single dime of Jamal's fake crypto empire. I pulled up the complex financial tracking software I used for corporate embezzlement cases. I imported the banking data I had legally accessed through the federal database. The digital ledger of Jamal's main limited liability company appeared on my screen. It was a chaotic mess of rapid-fire transactions specifically designed to confuse casual auditors. But I was not a casual auditor. I set up an algorithmic filter to track the largest outgoing wire transfers over the past 12 months. The results populated on my screen in bright red numbers. Jamal's crypto investment fund was completely devoid of any actual cryptocurrency assets. There were no digital wallets holding Bitcoin or Ethereum. There were no trading algorithms or blockchain investments. It was nothing more than a textbook Ponzi scheme. He was aggressively recruiting new local investors, promising them guaranteed 20% monthly returns. But the moment their investment capital hit Jamal's corporate account, he immediately wired the funds to a secondary checking account. I tracked that secondary account and found the ugly truth. Jamal's investors were not funding the future of decentralized finance. They were directly funding Amanda's designer wardrobe. I watched the digital paper trail with utter disgust. An $80,000 deposit from a retired schoolteacher was wired directly to a luxury car dealership the very next day to pay for Jamal's new sports car. A $50,000 investment from a local dentist was immediately routed to a high-end travel agency to cover Amanda's lavish trip to the Maldives. My sister was flaunting her supposed wealth to her 50,000 followers, but every single designer handbag and five-star hotel stay was paid for with stolen money. Jamal was robbing innocent people blind to maintain the illusion of massive success. But Jamal was not smart enough to pull this off completely alone. He needed a financial anchor to make his fake company look legitimate to the bigger investors. That is where my parents came into the picture. I opened another tab and cross-referenced my father's personal tax identification number with Jamal's offshore accounts. What I found made my stomach churn. Richard and Patricia were not just silent victims of Jamal's bad business decisions, they were active co-conspirators. Over the past 3 years, my parents had been quietly liquidating their retirement accounts and selling off their valuable art collection. But instead of reporting that massive income to the government, they funneled every single dollar into Jamal's offshore shell companies located in the Cayman Islands. They were using Jamal's fake crypto fund as a massive money laundering machine to hide their wealth and completely dodge the Internal Revenue Service. It was a highly illegal tax evasion strategy. They thought hiding their money in the Caymans would protect it from the massive debts they owed locally. But their brilliant plan had a fatal flaw. In order to get the massive $5 million commercial loan, Jamal needed to keep the Ponzi scheme afloat. My parents had to secretly guarantee the debt using the forged trust documents. They had tied their hidden offshore accounts directly to the fraudulent loan. The entire financial structure was a giant house of cards built on federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and identity theft. I sat back in my chair staring at the damning evidence glowing on my monitor. The sheer scale of their arrogance was breathtaking. They truly believed they were smarter than everyone else. They thought they could steal from investors, steal from the government, and steal from their own daughter without ever facing the severe consequences. I began compiling the transaction histories, the wire transfer receipts, and the offshore account numbers into a massive encrypted dossier. I organized everything chronologically, making it incredibly easy for a federal prosecutor to follow the money. I was no longer just dealing with a toxic family dispute. I was dealing with a massive, organized criminal enterprise, and I was going to burn it straight to the ground. I needed absolute, undeniable proof of the forgery before I could finalize my report to the federal authorities. I navigated back to the secure offshore banking portal and located the primary document file for the $5 million commercial loan guarantee. I downloaded the high-resolution document and opened it in my specialized forensic analysis software. My grandfather had set up a blind trust for me when I was just a little girl. He knew exactly how reckless my parents were with money, and he wanted to ensure I had a secure future completely out of their reach. The trust contained a highly valuable commercial property in the downtown financial district that generated a steady stream of rental income. It was supposed to be legally ironclad. It was supposed to be untouchable by anyone except me. I scrolled past the dense legal jargon, the complex indemnification clauses, and the offshore banking regulations straight to the final signature page. I magnified the digital image to 400%. I stared intensely at the dark blue ink strokes forming my name. At first casual glance, it looked incredibly convincing. The loops on the capital letters and the sharp angle of the final stroke matched my typical handwriting style. But forensic accounting trains your eyes to see the microscopic imperfections that ordinary people completely miss. I opened my personal digital archives on my second computer monitor. I keep meticulous electronic records of every single legal document I have ever signed in my entire life. I pulled up my old college student loan applications from over a decade ago. I placed the digital documents side by side on my dual screens. I used a specialized overlay tool to place the signature from the Cayman Islands offshore loan directly on top of the signature from my freshman year college application. My breath hitched in my throat. They matched perfectly. They matched far too perfectly. Human beings never ever sign their name the exact same way twice. There are always microscopic variations in pen pressure angle and pacing. This was a direct digital copy. Someone had scanned my old college document, isolated my signature using photo editing software, and digitally stamped it directly onto the massive commercial loan guarantee. They had even added a slight digital blur to make it look like wet ink that had been scanned. It was a calculated and premeditated act of absolute deception. My parents had not just borrowed against their own failing suburban estate. They had legally pledged my protected commercial property as collateral for Jamal's collapsing Ponzi scheme. If Jamal defaulted on his massive offshore loan, which was absolutely inevitable, given the rapid rate he was bleeding cash to pay for his luxury lifestyle, the international bank would legally seize the trust fund my grandfather built for me. They had already stolen my past by secretly draining my college fund when I was a teenager. Now, they were actively trying to steal the future security of my children. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, feeling a cold surge of intense mental clarity. This was no longer a simple toxic family dispute or a bad business deal gone wrong. By electronically transmitting a fraudulent document with a forged signature to an international offshore bank, my parents and Jamal had committed severe federal wire fraud. By intentionally using my personal identifying information to secure a massive multi-million-dollar line of credit, they had committed aggravated identity theft. These were not minor civil infractions that could be settled out of court. These were severe federal felonies carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences. I saved the digital overlay analysis and added the irrefutable visual proof to my master dossier. Every single piece of the complex puzzle was now firmly in place. I had the fraudulent outgoing wire transfers, the hidden offshore account numbers, the fake business registries, and the digitally forged signatures. The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were going to have an absolute field day with this massive case. I thought about how smug Jamal looked sitting on that white leather sofa drinking his expensive bourbon. I thought about my mother aggressively demanding I apologize to the sister who was happily spending money stolen from innocent investors. They had built an entire kingdom of lies and secretly placed the heaviest burden of their deceit squarely onto my shoulders. But they had severely underestimated the quiet daughter they had always mocked. I was not just going to report them. I was going to make sure the federal government dismantled their entire fraudulent lives piece by piece. I carefully backed up the entire encrypted folder to two separate secure external hard drives. I closed my heavy laptop and walked quietly down the dark hallway toward our bedroom. The massive New Year's Eve party was just around the corner, and I was going to give them a midnight countdown they would never forget. The next morning, the house was blissfully quiet. David had taken Leo and Mia to the local park to give me the uninterrupted time I desperately needed. I made a fresh pot of dark roast coffee and carried my favorite mug back into my home office. Today was the day I forged the actual weapon. I sat at my desk and opened the official website for the Internal Revenue Service. I navigated straight to the Criminal Investigation Division and downloaded IRS Form 211. This is the official application for an award for original information. It is the exact document whistleblowers use to report massive tax fraud to the federal government. I printed a physical copy just to feel the weight of the paper in my hands. It felt incredibly heavy. It felt like absolute justice. I spent the next 4 hours meticulously translating my digital forensic findings into the rigid legal framework required by the government authorities. The IRS does not care about toxic family drama or who insulted who at a holiday party. They only care about cold, hard, verifiable numbers, and I had the numbers in absolute spades. I started the documentation with Jamal's fake crypto investment firm. I detailed his elaborate Ponzi scheme, highlighting the exact offshore routing numbers he used to hide the stolen investor funds. I attached the forged signature analysis, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had illegally secured the massive $5 million commercial loan. Then I moved on to the most painful but necessary part of the federal report: my own parents. I calculated the exact amount of capital gains and income tax my parents had evaded by hiding their liquidated assets in the Cayman Islands. Federal tax law is incredibly complex, but the strict penalties for willful financial evasion are brutally straightforward. By my expert estimation, Richard and Patricia had hidden almost $3 million in undeclared assets over the past 3 years alone. When you factor in the massive federal fraud penalties, the rapidly accumulating interest, and the mandatory criminal fines, my parents and Jamal collectively owed the United States government over $2 million in back taxes. The IRS is the most ruthless collection agency on the entire planet. They will freeze corporate bank accounts, seize physical property, and garnish future wages without a single second thought. My parents were about to face a severe financial reckoning they could never charm their way out of. I paused my rapid typing and took a long sip of my coffee. A small part of me, the wounded little girl who just wanted her parents to love her, wondered if this was going too far. But then I clearly remembered the cold smirk on my mother's face when she openly mocked my son's learning disability. I remembered my father threatening to cut me out of his life over a fake social media aesthetic. I remembered the digitally forged signature that tried to permanently steal my children's financial future. The brief hesitation instantly vanished from my mind. I was not destroying their lives out of petty spite. I was simply handing them the exact legal bill for the immense destruction they had caused themselves. I carefully typed my own social security number and personal identifying information into the whistleblower applicant section. Under federal law, whistleblowers who provide actionable intelligence leading to a successful tax recovery are legally entitled to between 15 and 30% of the collected proceeds. I was not doing this for the financial payout, but I fully intended to collect every single dime the government offered me. It was the ultimate poetic justice. I would use the massive reward money from their criminal downfall to completely secure the very future they tried to steal. I saved the final draft of the comprehensive IRS report. I then created an identical secure submission package for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division. The digital guillotine was fully built and completely loaded. All I had to do was press the final submit button. I stretched my stiff arms above my head, feeling a deep and profound sense of accomplishment. I glanced at the digital clock on my office wall. It was just past 2 in the afternoon. Suddenly, the quiet peace of the house was violently shattered by a deafening pounding sound. Someone was hammering their heavy fists against my wooden front door. The loud, aggressive knocking echoed down the hallway, making my heart jump wildly into my throat. I quickly locked my laptop screen and hurried out of my office. I walked quietly down the hall and peered at the digital screen of our front porch security camera. Standing on my front porch, pacing back and forth like a trapped wild animal, was Jamal. His expensive designer suit jacket was violently crumpled, and his silk tie was completely undone. His face was twisted into a dark, terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He raised his heavy fist and slammed it against the thick wood again, screaming my name at the top of his lungs. He looked completely unhinged, and he was standing right outside my home. I took a deep breath and quickly pressed the small silver button on my smartwatch. A red icon appeared, confirming the audio recording application was running. I was alone, but I was not afraid of a man whose life was built on lies. I walked to the door and unlocked the deadbolt. I opened it a few inches, keeping my foot planted against the bottom edge to prevent him from pushing inside. Jamal shoved his weight against the wood, trying to force himself into my hallway. "Move out of the way right now, Rachel," he barked. "We are going to have a serious conversation right now." I shoved back with everything I had, keeping the gap narrow. "You are not coming inside, Jamal," I said, my voice calm. "State your business and get off my property before I call the police." He glared at me, his chest heaving. His eyes were bloodshot and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. He looked like a man who knew his empire was crumbling. "You think you are so incredibly smart, do you not?" he sneered, leaning closer to the gap. "You think walking out of Christmas dinner makes you some kind of hero. Amanda has been crying for days and your parents are having panic attacks. You need to pull out your phone right now and text the family group chat. You are going to issue a full apology to my wife, and you are going to retract whatever pathetic threat you made about a gift." I looked at him with feigned confusion, intentionally playing the part of the clueless sister he always believed me to be. "I do not understand why you are so upset, Jamal," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. "It was just a stupid text message. Why do you care what I say to my parents? They are my family, not yours." My deliberate dismissal of his authority ignited his massive ego exactly as I had planned. He slammed his flat palm against the doorframe. "Because I am the reason your family even has a roof over their heads," he yelled, his voice echoing down the street. "You are just a pathetic calculator monkey who crunches numbers in a tiny cubicle. You have absolutely no idea how the real world actually works. I run a multi-million-dollar financial firm. I have a team of powerful corporate lawyers on retainer who could crush you and your little bedpan cleaner husband into the dirt before you wake up tomorrow. Do not ever think you can threaten us." He was practically spitting the words at me, his arrogance blinding him to his own monumental stupidity. I maintained my act of wide-eyed innocence, slightly lowering my voice to draw him in further. "You do not run my parents' lives, Jamal," I countered softly, injecting just enough fake defiance to keep him talking. "My father is a wealthy man. He would never let you control him." Jamal let out a loud barking laugh that sounded completely unhinged. "Wealthy," he mocked loudly. "Richard is a broke, pathetic old man living on borrowed time. He does not own that giant mansion anymore. I own it. My primary limited liability company holds the complete legal deed to that entire estate. I have them eating right out of the palm of my hand. If I snap my fingers tomorrow, they are out on the street with absolutely nothing. They gave me total financial control. So when I tell you to apologize and fall back in line, you do exactly what I say. You do not mess with my money, and you certainly do not mess with my family." I glanced down at my wrist. The tiny red recording icon was still blinking steadily, capturing every single word of his arrogant confession. He had just verbally admitted to holding the primary collateral deed through his shell company, directly linking himself to the fraudulent documents and the illegal offshore transfers. I had everything I needed. The act was officially over. I looked back up at Jamal, letting the fake confusion completely drop from my face. My expression shifted into an icy, deadpan stare. "Thank you for clarifying that, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I will be sure to keep your real estate investments in mind." I did not give him a second to process the sudden change in my demeanor. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut with all my strength right in his shocked face. I quickly threw the brass deadbolt, locking him outside in the freezing cold. I stood in the quiet hallway listening to him scream a few more empty threats before his heavy footsteps retreated down the driveway. I stopped the digital audio recording. It was clear. It was clear that Jamal was unraveling entirely, but failing to intimidate me only made him desperate to find another weak link. Since he could not bully his way through my front door, he decided to target the man he wrongly assumed was the easiest mark in our family. Later that evening, David was just finishing an exhausting 12-hour shift at the pediatric intensive care unit. He walked out the heavy glass doors of the hospital and headed into the dimly lit concrete parking garage. The air was bitterly cold, and the massive structure was mostly empty. As David approached our reliable but aging sedan, a dark figure stepped out from the shadows of a concrete pillar. It was Jamal. He had tracked my husband to his workplace. Jamal leaned aggressively against the hood of David's car, crossing his arms over his expensive wool overcoat. "You and I need to have a little talk, nurse," Jamal said, his voice dripping with condescension. David did not flinch or step back. He stopped a few feet away, keeping his expression entirely neutral. "Move away from my vehicle, Jamal." David said, his voice calm but firm. "I want to go home to my wife and kids." Jamal let out a harsh scoff, shaking his head slowly. "Your wife is exactly the problem, David." Jamal sneered, taking a step forward. "She is completely out of control. You need to rein her in and teach her how to respect her family. As the man of the house, it is your job to keep her quiet. But I guess spending all day wiping babies and taking orders from real doctors has made you soft. You need to step up and control your woman before she ruins everything for everyone." Jamal was deliberately using toxic microaggressions to provoke a physical reaction. He wanted David to lose his temper and throw a punch. If David assaulted him in a hospital parking garage, Jamal could easily file charges and use that leverage against me. But Jamal severely underestimated the psychological fortitude required to work in a pediatric intensive care unit. David dealt with hysterical, angry, and grieving people every single day. A desperate con artist in a tailored suit was absolutely nothing to him. David casually reached into his scrub pocket and pressed the unlock button on his key fob. The car's headlights flashed twice, illuminating Jamal's angry face. What Jamal did not know was that unlocking the car automatically activated our high-definition dashboard camera. The hidden lens was now recording crystal-clear audio and video of everything happening right in front of the hood. David crossed his arms, mirroring Jamal's posture, but radiating absolute calm. "Rachel does not need to be controlled, Jamal," David replied evenly. "She is just extremely thorough at her job. She told me about the massive $5 million offshore loan you took out. She knows her signature is somehow on that guarantor document. She thinks you and Richard faked it. If you did something illegal, you should probably just walk away right now." Jamal laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed off the cold concrete walls. He took the bait instantly. His massive ego simply could not resist the urge to brag about his perceived superior intellect. "Faked it," Jamal mocked, waving his hand dismissively. "Please. I am a professional financial manager, David. I do not fake things. I engage in creative document editing. Your wife signed a student loan document a decade ago. We simply repurposed her signature for a more lucrative opportunity. It is just business strategy. Richard and Patricia gladly provided the old paperwork to help secure the future of the family. Rachel was not using that old trust fund property anyway. We put that lazy equity to actual work." David raised an eyebrow, acting slightly intimidated to keep Jamal talking. So you admit you copied her signature without her permission? David asked, his tone carefully crafted to sound naive. Jamal smirked, leaning back against the hood of the car again, entirely unaware of the camera lens staring straight at his chest. I admit absolutely nothing to a lowly nurse, Jamal stated proudly. But even if I did copy it, who is going to believe a disgruntled sister over a successful investment firm founder? I have millions of dollars and a team of lawyers on my side. You two have a public sector salary and a cheap sedan. You tell Rachel to drop her little investigation and issue that public apology to Amanda immediately. If she does not, I will personally make sure you are both financially ruined and drowning in legal fees for the rest of your miserable lives. David looked at Jamal with profound pity and absolute disgust in his calm, dark eyes as he smiled. David pressed a button on the car stereo, stopping the recording. He smiled a genuine warm smile that completely unnerved Jamal. "Have a good night, Jamal," David said, rolling up his window without waiting for a reply. He started the engine, leaving Jamal standing alone in the cold, empty parking garage. When David got home, he showed me the clear footage. Jamal had handed us his own execution order on a silver platter. The next morning, my phone rang. It was my father, Richard. I almost did not answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello, Richard," I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. "Oh, Rachel, my dear." His voice came through the speaker, dripping with an artificial sweetness that immediately made my skin crawl. "It has been such a stressful week, has it not? Your mother and I have been talking, and we simply hate this terrible rift between us. Family is everything, Rachel. We want to make things right. We want to move forward." He sounded exactly like a terrible actor reading lines from a script. I leaned back in my chair, raising an eyebrow even though he could not see me. "Moving forward sounds nice, Richard," I replied cautiously. "What exactly did you have in mind?" "Well," he continued, his tone practically singing with fake joy, "I booked a private room at the Capitol Grill downtown for tomorrow night. Just you, me, your mother Amanda, and Jamal. A nice, quiet, clearing the air dinner. No fighting, just good food and honest apologies. We really want to put all this ugly business behind us." The sudden shift from threatening to disinherit me to offering honest apologies was completely jarring. I knew exactly what was happening. Jamal had panicked after his confrontation with David. He realized he had said too much on camera, and he likely ran straight to my parents, demanding they fix the situation before I went to the authorities. They were terrified, and when toxic people get terrified, they get incredibly manipulative. "I would love to come to dinner, Richard," I said, letting a slight edge of fake relief slip into my voice. "I am so glad we can finally talk this out like adults." "Oh, wonderful," he exclaimed, sounding genuinely relieved. He paused for a fraction of a second and then dropped the actual bait. "Oh, and by the way, Rachel, while we are all together, I just have a tiny standard tax release form for you to sign. It is just some boring old paperwork regarding that dusty trust fund your grandfather set up. Just a minor technicality, so my accountant can close out the fiscal year properly. It will literally take you 2 seconds to sign, and then we can get back to celebrating our family." There it was, the trap. They were going to try and force me to legally legitimize their forged documents under the guise of a family reconciliation dinner. They thought they could ply me with expensive wine and sweet words until I blindly signed away my own protection. It is truly staggering how stupid they thought I was. A standard tax release form, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Sure, Richard. Bring whatever you need me to sign. We can get it all taken care of tomorrow night." I hung up the phone and let out a long breath. They were handing me the perfect stage. I walked out to the living room where David was reading a book on the couch. I sat down next to him and rested my head on his shoulder. "My father just invited me to a clearing the air dinner at the Capitol Grill tomorrow night," I told him. "He wants me to sign a tiny standard tax release form to put all this behind us." David lowered his book, his eyes widening slightly. "They are actually going to try and make you sign a retroactive consent form," he asked, shaking his head in disbelief. They really think you are that naive. I smiled, feeling a cold surge of anticipation. They think I am desperate for their love, David. They think I will sign anything just to be welcomed back into the family fold. I need you to finalize the IRS and FBI dossiers tonight. Put the dashboard camera footage on a secure encrypted flash drive. Attach all the digital forensic files, the wire transfer logs, and the offshore account numbers. We are submitting everything tomorrow night. David squeezed my hand, his face completely serious. Are you absolutely sure about this, Rachel? He asked softly. Once we hit submit, there is no going back. This will completely destroy them. I looked at the man who had stood by me through years of their constant belittling. I thought about the forged documents that could have ruined my children's future. I am absolutely sure, I said, my voice steady and resolute. They built this entire bomb themselves. I am just giving them the detonator. Tomorrow night at the steakhouse, we finish this once and for all. The next evening, the air was bitterly cold as I pulled my car up to the valet stand outside the Capitol Grill. The restaurant was a fortress of mahogany wood and dim amber lighting, designed to make wealthy people feel secure while they spent exorbitant amounts of money. David had stayed home with the kids, carefully monitoring the encrypted flash drives and waiting for my signal. I walked through the heavy glass doors wearing a tailored black dress that made me look completely unbothered. The hostess led me to a private dining room at the back of the restaurant. As she opened the sliding wooden doors, I saw them sitting around a massive circular table. Richard, Patricia, Amanda, and Jamal were already sipping expensive cocktails. When I walked in, they immediately plastered fake smiles across their faces. Richard even stood up and pulled out a chair for me, acting like the perfect gentleman father. It was a terrifyingly convincing performance. I sat down and smoothed my linen napkin over my lap. A waiter quickly appeared and poured me a glass of sparkling water. "Oh, Rachel, you look lovely tonight," Patricia cooed, reaching across the table to lightly pat my hand. "We are so glad you decided to be reasonable and join us." Amanda chimed in, nodding vigorously. "Yes, we really just want to get back to normal," she said, adjusting her expensive diamond necklace. "The holidays are supposed to be about family." I took a slow sip of my water, letting the cold liquid settle my stomach. I looked at Jamal, who was swirling his drink and watching me with the eyes of a predator who thought he had cornered his prey. "Let us skip the warm-up act, Richard," I said, placing my glass down. "You did not book a private room at an expensive steakhouse to compliment my dress. You said you had a standard tax release form for me to sign. Let me see it." The fake smiles vanished instantly. The sudden shift in the room was palpable. Richard cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie. He reached into his leather briefcase resting on the floor and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slid it across the polished wooden table. It stopped right in front of my plate. I did not open it immediately. I just stared at it. "It is just a basic legal formality," Richard said, his voice losing its artificial warmth. "Jamal recently restructured some of our primary family assets to maximize our investment returns. We simply need your signature to ratify the changes made to the blind trust. It protects you from any tax liabilities. Go ahead and read it." I picked up the envelope and pulled out the crisp white pages. My eyes rapidly scanned the dense legal jargon. Because I spent my career deciphering financial contracts, I did not need a lawyer to translate it for me. It was a retroactive consent and ratification agreement. The document explicitly stated that I, the primary beneficiary of the trust, was fully aware of and had granted absolute prior authorization for my signature to be used on the $5 million commercial loan guarantee. It contained a comprehensive liability waiver, legally barring me from ever pressing civil or criminal charges against Richard, Patricia, or Jamal's limited liability companies regarding the use of the property. They wanted me to grant them retroactive immunity for federal wire fraud. It was a breathtakingly audacious piece of paper. I looked up from the document. "This is not a standard tax release, Richard," I said, keeping my voice deadly calm. "This is a written confession. You forged my signature to secure a fraudulent offshore loan, and now you want me to legalize your felony." Jamal slammed his hand flat on the table, rattling the heavy silver flatware. "Watch your mouth, Rachel," he warned, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You are completely out of your depth here. You sign that paper right now, or things are going to get incredibly ugly for you and your little husband." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His face hardened into a mask of pure, ruthless determination. "Let me make this crystal clear for you, Rachel," my father said, his tone cold and measured. "You are going to sign that document tonight. If you refuse, I will personally hire the most aggressive corporate litigation firm in this city. I will file lawsuit after lawsuit against you. I will tie you up in endless legal battles until you are completely bankrupt. You will have to sell your house to pay your attorney fees. Your precious children will have absolutely nothing. I have the resources to destroy your life, and I will not hesitate to use them to protect this family. Sign the paper." Amanda scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I was being completely unreasonable. "Honestly, Rachel, why do you always have to be so difficult?" she complained, taking a sip of her martini. "Jamal is making us all rich. You are just trying to sabotage us because you are jealous. You did not think of the investment strategy first. Just sign the stupid paper so we can order our dinner. I am starving." Patricia leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "Do not test your father, Rachel," she hissed. "We gave you everything. We clothed you and fed you and put up with your constant mediocrity. The absolute least you can do is sign a simple piece of paper to help your brother-in-law secure our financial legacy. If you walk out of here without signing, you will be completely dead to us." I looked down at the pen resting beside the document. It was a heavy silver Mont Blanc pen, carefully placed there by Richard to make the signing feel official. I picked up the pen and turned it over in my fingers, feeling its cool weight. Jamal's arrogant smirk returned. He thought I was yielding. He thought his intimidation tactic and Richard's financial threats had finally broken my spirit. What they completely failed to realize was that this retroactive consent form was the final piece of evidence I needed. By drafting this specific document, they had formally acknowledged in writing that my original signature was never authorized. They had handed me the smoking gun wrapped in a neat legal bow. I did not feel fear. I felt an overwhelming sense of absolute victory. I gently placed the heavy silver pen back onto the polished mahogany table. I pushed the thick manila envelope back toward the center of the table, right next to a glowing candle. "I am not signing that, Richard," I said with a calm smile. Right on cue, our waiter stepped into the private room holding a leather-bound notepad. "Good evening, everyone," the waiter said politely. "Are we ready to order?" Richard opened his mouth to dismiss the waiter, but I smoothly cut him off. "Yes, we are," I said brightly, looking up at the young man. "I will start with the Grand Seafood Tower, please. And for my main course, I will have the bone and dry-aged ribeye cooked medium rare. Oh, and please add the truffle macaroni and cheese and the jumbo grilled asparagus on the side. I will also take a glass of your most expensive vintage Cabernet." The waiter scribbled furiously, nodding with a professional smile. Richard stared at me, his jaw slightly unhinged. "You are not ordering dinner until you sign that document," he hissed under his breath as the waiter stepped out of the room. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, refreshing sip. "I told you I am not signing it," I replied, leaning comfortably back in my plush chair. "It is a completely fraudulent document designed to cover up aggravated identity theft. I do not participate in federal felonies before my main course." Jamal let out a nervous laugh, but it sounded incredibly forced. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, which suddenly seemed a bit too tight. "You are being completely ridiculous, Rachel," Jamal said, trying to regain his dominant posture. "It is just a standard corporate restructuring document. People sign them every single day." I turned my gaze directly to Jamal, locking eyes with him. I let the silence stretch for a few uncomfortable seconds before I spoke. "I find corporate restructuring absolutely fascinating, Jamal," I said, my voice dangerously soft. especially when it involves a tangled web of 7 different shell companies, all registered to a single empty mail drop address in Delaware. Jamal completely froze. His hand, which was reaching for his bourbon, stopped dead in midair. Amanda looked back and forth between us, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. "What is she talking about?" "Jamal?" Amanda whined. "What Delaware companies? I thought your crypto firm was based here in the city." Jamal did not answer her. A distinct bead of sweat formed on his forehead, reflecting the dim amber light of the chandelier. He stared at me, his eyes wide with sudden, terrifying realization. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and steepled my fingers. "Tell me, Jamal." I continued, my voice slicing through the tense silence of the room. "Did you know the Internal Revenue Service audits offshore Delaware limited liability companies with a 95% penalty rate? Especially when those companies are aggressively funneling unverified investor funds directly into offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. It is a massive red flag for their criminal investigation division. The tracking algorithms pick it up almost instantly." Jamal swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. The arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. "How do you know about the Cayman accounts?" he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. Richard slammed his fist on the table, causing the silverware to clatter loudly. "What is going on here?" Richard demanded, looking from me to Jamal. "What Cayman accounts?" Jamal told me the collateral was safely held in a domestic blind trust. I laughed, a genuine bright sound that echoed off the dark wood-paneled walls. "Oh, Richard, you poor foolish man," I said, shaking my head. "Did you really think he was telling you the truth? He used your forged documents to secure a $5 million commercial loan, and then he immediately wired the money offshore to hide it from his own investors. You literally handed him the rope to hang this entire family." Patricia gasped, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. Richard turned pale, his eyes darting frantically toward Jamal, who was now visibly trembling and wiping his sweaty forehead with a linen napkin. Amanda slammed her hands on the table. "Stop using all these weird accounting words," she yelled, her voice shrill and annoying. "You are ruining the dinner, Rachel. Just sign the stupid paper so Jamal can buy me that new car he promised. You are just trying to make us look bad because you are poor." I looked at my sister with absolute pity. "Enjoy your fake life while it lasts." "Amanda," I said softly, "because the bill is finally coming due." At that moment, the waiter returned, carrying a massive silver tray holding the steaming, dry-aged ribeye and the decadent side dishes I had ordered. He carefully placed the beautiful plates in front of me. It smelled absolutely divine, but I had lost my appetite for dining with criminals. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills. I laid the cash neatly on top of the white tablecloth right next to my untouched steak. "That should more than cover my portion of the meal and a generous tip for the waiter," I said, standing up from the table. I picked up my coat and slung my purse over my shoulder. I looked down at the 4 of them, sitting in stunned, horrified silence. The unsigned, retroactive consent form was still sitting exactly where I left it. "Enjoy your clearing the air dinner," I said smoothly. "I have some very important files to upload tonight." I turned around and walked out of the private dining room, leaving them to drown in their own catastrophic mess. The heavy glass doors of the Capitol Grill closed behind me, shutting away the toxic atmosphere of that private dining room. The freezing winter wind bit into my cheeks, but it felt incredibly refreshing. I handed my ticket to the young valet, standing under the heat lamps. He brought my car around quickly. I handed him a generous tip and slipped into the driver's seat. I locked the car doors immediately and started the engine just to get the heater running. I did not pull out into the busy downtown street. Instead, I reached into my large leather tote bag and pulled out my heavy work laptop. My hands were perfectly steady. The nervous adrenaline that usually accompanied these toxic family confrontations was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a cold, mechanical precision. I opened the laptop screen, letting its bright, stark glow illuminate the dark interior of my car. I plugged my secure encrypted flash drive into the side USB port and connected the computer to my high-speed mobile hotspot. I opened my encrypted web browser and navigated directly to the Internal Revenue Service Whistleblower Office submission portal. I had already completely filled out Form 211 down to the very last decimal point earlier today. Now it was just a matter of attaching the hard digital evidence. I carefully dragged and dropped the massive folder containing Jamal's tangled Delaware Limited Liability Company ledgers. Next went the Cayman Islands offshore banking routing numbers and the detailed wire transfer receipts proving the Ponzi scheme. I attached my comprehensive forensic analysis, outlining exactly how Richard and Patricia had systematically hidden over $3 million in liquidated assets to evade federal capital gains taxes. Then came the most damning evidence of all. I uploaded the high-resolution digital overlay that mathematically proved my signature on the $5 million commercial loan guarantee was a direct digital forgery lifted directly from my old college application. To seal the case completely, I attached the audio files. The first was Jamal's unhinged rant on my front porch, where he proudly admitted his shell company owned my parents' sprawling estate. The second was the crystal-clear dashcam audio David captured in the cold hospital parking garage, where Jamal arrogantly confessed to creative document editing to secure the massive loan. With the IRS package fully loaded, I opened a second browser window for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I navigated straight to their white-collar crime division tip portal. The FBI handles the aggravated identity theft and the federal wire fraud components of their criminal enterprise. I uploaded the exact same meticulously organized evidence files. I made sure to clearly cross-reference the specific federal statutes they had violated. I wanted to make the federal prosecutor's job as incredibly easy as possible. When you hand the government a fully investigated slam-dunk case wrapped in a neat digital bow, they tend to move with terrifying speed. I stared intensely at the two bright blue submit buttons glowing on my computer screen. This was the absolute point of no return. For 33 years, I had allowed these people to diminish my worth. I had allowed them to treat my hard-working husband like dirt and mock my innocent children. They truly thought the biological accident of sharing DNA gave them a permanent free pass to abuse, manipulate, and steal from me. They were about to learn that arrogant actions have permanent, devastating legal consequences. I took one deep, calming breath and pressed the trackpad, clicking Submit on the IRS portal. A green confirmation checkmark appeared on the screen. Without hesitating for a single second, I clicked Submit on the FBI portal. Another bright green checkmark flashed. It was done. The digital files were officially in the hands of federal law enforcement. I closed the laptop and placed it securely back into my tote bag. I leaned my head against the leather steering wheel and looked at the digital clock on my dashboard. It was 8:15 in the evening. The massive, lavish New Year's Eve party Richard and Patricia were hosting was exactly 48 hours away. They had invited dozens of local politicians, wealthy socialites, and potential new victims for Jamal's fake investment fund. They were planning to ring in the new year, celebrating their fraudulent wealth and their perceived superiority over everyone else. They had absolutely no idea that a massive financial guillotine was already dropping right toward their necks. I put the car into drive and pulled out of the restaurant parking lot. I drove through the dark city streets, heading back to my quiet home, my supportive husband, and my beautiful children. I had a strong feeling this new year was going to start off with an incredibly loud bang. 48 hours later, the massive wrought iron gates of my parents' estate were thrown wide open. It was New Year's Eve, and the sprawling property was completely transformed into a glittering fortress of fake wealth. A line of valet attendants stood shivering in the freezing cold, eagerly opening the doors of sleek luxury sedans and massive imported SUVs. David and I did not hand our keys to the valet. We parked our reliable sedan down the street and walked up the long, illuminated driveway together. I felt absolutely zero anxiety. My heart was beating with a slow, rhythmic calm. Tonight, I was not the invisible scapegoat or the boring accountant. I was the executioner. I wore a floor-length emerald green silk gown that fit me perfectly. It was elegant and commanding. David wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit that made him look incredibly handsome. We linked arms and walked right through the massive oak front doors. Nobody stopped us, because the private security guards assumed we were just another pair of wealthy guests. The interior of the house was obnoxiously lavish. A massive ice sculpture of a swan dominated the center of the grand foyer. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated through the thick crowd carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and expensive caviar. The massive living room had been cleared of its heavy furniture to create a makeshift ballroom for the evening. A live jazz band played softly on a raised wooden stage in the far corner, filling the room with a smooth, sophisticated melody. The room was packed with the exact kind of people my parents desperately wanted to impress. I recognized a few corrupt local politicians, a handful of desperate social climbers, and several wealthy older couples who looked completely out of place. These were the fresh victims Jamal was actively trying to lure into his fraudulent offshore web. I spotted Jamal standing near the ice sculpture holding court with three older men who looked like retired doctors. Jamal was wearing a custom velvet tuxedo jacket, laughing loudly and gesturing with his expensive drink. He was completely in his element, spinning a web of financial lies to steal their hard-earned retirement savings. A few feet away, Amanda was aggressively posing for a hired photographer. She was wearing a heavily beaded silver designer dress that she had proudly bragged online cost $10,000. The dress was paid for with stolen money, but she posed with the absolute entitlement of a self-made millionaire. My mother, Patricia, was floating through the crowd, playing the role of the gracious high society hostess. She wore a heavy diamond necklace that I knew was purchased using the illegal Cayman Islands accounts. She was smiling brightly at a local city councilman when her eyes suddenly drifted across the crowded room and locked onto me. Her fake smile instantly vanished. Her face flushed an ugly shade of red. She quickly excused herself from the councilman and began marching across the marble floor directly toward us. "Rachel, what on earth are you doing here?" Patricia hissed as soon as she was close enough. Her voice was kept low to avoid a major scene, but her eyes were wide with pure fury. "You and your husband are completely uninvited. You humiliated this family at the steakhouse, and you refused to sign the necessary legal documents. You have absolutely no right to show your faces in my home tonight. Get out right now before I call the security guards to physically drag you both down the driveway." I looked down at my mother. For the first time in my entire life, she looked incredibly small to me. The invisible chains of obligation and fear that tied me to her approval were completely broken. I did not feel angry. I just felt a profound sense of pity for the pathetic house of cards she had chosen to die in. "I am not here to drink your stolen champagne, Patricia," I said, my voice perfectly calm and easily carrying over the soft jazz music. "And this is no longer your home. I am just here to deliver my holiday gift." Before she could even process my words, I let go of David's hand and stepped right past her. I walked with absolute purpose through the crowded ballroom. People turned to look at me, admiring the emerald dress and whispering to each other. I did not stop or slow down. I walked straight past a horrified Amanda, who nearly dropped her drink. I walked right past Jamal, whose arrogant smirk melted into a look of absolute sheer terror. I marched directly up the three small wooden steps onto the raised stage and walked straight toward the lead singer of the jazz band. I reached out and firmly grabbed the heavy silver microphone from its stand. I held the heavy silver microphone tightly in my right hand, feeling its cool metallic weight ground my racing thoughts. I tapped the metal mesh top twice with my index finger. The sharp thud echoed loudly through the massive professional speakers positioned around the ballroom. The sudden harsh noise instantly cut through the soft melody of the jazz band. The musicians lowered their instruments, looking at me in sheer confusion. The lively chatter of the wealthy guests died down to an uneasy murmur, and then faded into complete silence. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the wooden stage. They were expecting a festive New Year's Eve toast from the hosts. They were expecting to raise their crystal champagne flutes and cheer. Instead, they saw me standing there tall and unbothered. I looked out over the sea of designer clothing and glittering jewelry. My gaze swept past the local politicians and the confused socialites until I found the specific group of retired investors Jamal had been talking to just moments ago. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the silent room. "I am Rachel. Richard and Patricia are my parents, and Jamal is my brother-in-law. I apologize for interrupting your elegant evening, but I have a very important holiday announcement to make. You see, my family decided not to give my young children any gifts this past Christmas. They publicly announced that my husband and I simply were not successful enough to deserve their generosity. They told us that mediocrity should not be rewarded. They prefer the company of wealthy, self-made investors." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. A few people cast uncomfortable glances toward Richard and Patricia, who were frozen in absolute horror near the ice sculpture. Amanda looked like she was going to be physically sick. "So tonight, I brought a special gift of my own," I continued, holding my free hand up. "And because my family values financial success so deeply, I decided to share this gift with all of you, especially those of you who have recently invested your hard-earned retirement savings into Jamal's new crypto investment firm." The word crypto hung in the air like a heavy weight. The three retired doctors Jamal had been charming suddenly stood up very straight. Their polite smiles vanished, replaced by a sharp, defensive alertness. Jamal's face twisted into a mask of pure feral panic. The polished, charismatic businessman persona completely evaporated. He dropped his expensive crystal glass. It shattered violently against the marble floor, sending shards of glass and expensive bourbon flying everywhere. "Shut up," Jamal screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Turn that microphone off right now." He shoved his way past a wealthy older woman, nearly knocking her to the floor. He charged toward the raised wooden stage, his heavy footsteps thudding aggressively against the marble. He was lunging straight for me, his hands reaching out to physically rip the microphone away from my face. Several guests gasped in shock, stepping back to avoid his sudden, violent outburst. But Jamal never even made it to the first wooden step. David moved with a sudden speed and stunning precision that caught absolutely everyone in the room entirely off guard. My husband spent his days gently handling premature infants, but he also spent years safely restraining panicked and combative patients in the emergency room. As Jamal aggressively lunged for the stage, David simply stepped directly into his path. David planted his feet firmly and dropped his shoulder just an inch. Jamal crashed heavily into David, expecting my husband to easily fold. Instead, Jamal hit what felt like a solid brick wall. David did not budge a single millimeter. He firmly grabbed Jamal's tailored velvet lapels with both hands and effortlessly shoved him backward. Jamal stumbled wildly, his leather shoes slipping on the spilled bourbon. He fell hard onto his back, sliding across the polished marble floor. He scrambled frantically, trying to quickly get back up, but David stepped forward, towering over him. David's expression was terrifyingly calm. He looked down at the desperate con artist with absolute authority. "You are not taking another step toward my wife," David said, his voice low but easily carrying in the silent room. "Stay exactly where you are, Jamal. Do not make me ask you twice." Jamal stared up at David, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with fear and humiliation. He realized in that exact moment that his physical intimidation tactics were completely useless. The wealthy crowd watched in stunned silence as the supposed financial genius cowered on the floor before the pediatric nurse he had mocked just a few days ago. I smiled down at my amazing protective husband and confidently raised the heavy silver microphone back to my lips once again. I smiled down at my amazing protective husband and confidently raised the heavy silver microphone back to my lips once again. "Before any of you write another massive check to Jamal's exclusive investment fund, I think you deserve to hear a direct update from the brilliant founder himself," I announced. I reached into my small silk evening clutch and pulled out my smartphone. The ballroom was so incredibly quiet, you could actually hear the ice melting in the crystal glasses left abandoned on the surrounding tables. I unlocked my digital screen and opened the specific audio file I had carefully selected. I held the speaker of my smartphone directly against the heavy metal microphone. Jamal's arrogant voice suddenly boomed through the massive professional sound system, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. The audio was crystal clear, capturing every single ounce of his malicious pride from our front porch confrontation. "I am the reason your family even has a roof over their heads," Jamal's recorded voice bragged loudly to the entire room. "Richard is a broke, pathetic old man living on borrowed time. He does not own that giant mansion anymore. I own it. My primary limited liability company holds the complete legal deed to that entire estate. I have them eating right out of the palm of my hand. If I snap my fingers tomorrow, they are out on the street with absolutely nothing." A collective gasp ripped through the elegant crowd of socialites and politicians. Several guests immediately turned their heads to stare directly at Richard. My father looked like he was going to physically collapse right there on the marble floor. His face completely drained of all color, and he grabbed the edge of a high cocktail table just to keep himself upright. Patricia covered her mouth with both of her manicured hands, her eyes darting frantically around the room as her carefully constructed high society image shattered into a million irreparable pieces in front of her most important friends. But I was not finished dismantling their lies. I tapped my screen and started the second audio clip. This was the recording David had captured on our dashboard camera in the freezing cold hospital parking garage. Once again, Jamal's smug, condescending tone filled the lavish ballroom. "I am a professional financial manager, David," the recording blared for everyone to hear. "I do not fake things. I engage in creative document editing. Your wife signed a student loan document a decade ago. We simply repurposed her signature for a more lucrative opportunity." Richard and Patricia gladly provided the old paperwork to help secure the future of the family. We put that lazy equity to actual work. The silence that followed the end of the second recording was utterly deafening. The sheer audacity of a man openly admitting to federal forgery in order to steal from his own family was simply too much for even the most polite society crowd to ignore. The three wealthy retired doctors who had been laughing and drinking with Jamal just minutes ago were no longer smiling. The tallest of the three men, a highly respected local surgeon, immediately pulled his smartphone out of his tailored tuxedo jacket pocket. "I need to call my attorney right now," the surgeon said, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "He is holding $500,000 of my retirement portfolio." Across the massive room, other wealthy investors began doing the exact same thing. The elegant New Year's Eve party instantly dissolved into a chaotic war room of panicked people, frantically dialing their legal teams and personal financial advisors. The glittering illusion of Jamal's brilliant crypto empire was completely destroyed in less than 2 minutes. Suddenly, a shrill, panicked voice pierced through the rising commotion in the room. "That is not real!" Amanda screamed at the top of her lungs. She pushed her way aggressively through the panicked guests, her $10,000 designer dress catching on a wooden chair. She stood near the edge of the stage, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Do not listen to her!" Amanda yelled desperately, trying to maintain her fragile grip on her fake luxury lifestyle. "It is an AI deepfake. People make them all the time on the internet now. She is just a jealous, bitter accountant who used a computer program to fake Jamal's voice because she hates us. It is all a massive lie." Amanda looked around the room, begging the wealthy crowd to believe her desperate excuse. But these were seasoned investors and professionals. They recognized the genuine cadence of the man they had just been speaking with. "Amanda, an AI deepfake cannot forge commercial loan documents," I stated calmly, my voice cutting through her hysterical lies. "And an AI deepfake definitely cannot save your husband from the massive federal investigation that is already well underway. I submitted every single ledger and forged document to the federal authorities 2 days ago." I turned my attention away from my hysterical sister and looked directly at the frantic investors who were still holding their cell phones. "You need to understand exactly what you have been financing. I told them, my voice ringing with absolute authority. Jamal's exclusive crypto investment fund does not hold a single digital asset. There is no trading algorithm and absolutely no blockchain portfolio. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme built entirely on smoke and mirrors. Every time you wrote a massive check, the money was instantly wired to a secondary corporate account. He used your hard-earned retirement funds to buy luxury sports cars, designer wardrobes, and five-star vacations for his wife. The remaining balance was heavily laundered through 7 different shell companies registered to a single empty mail drop address in Delaware before being quietly transferred to hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The local surgeon who had spoken up earlier stepped forward, his face a mask of pure fury. "You mean my entire investment is gone?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "Every single penny," I replied without hesitation. "But the financial fraud does not stop with your stolen investments." Jamal was bleeding cash at an incredible rate to maintain his fake billionaire lifestyle. To keep the scheme from collapsing, he desperately needed a massive influx of capital. He applied for a $5 million loan from a private offshore bank. But banks demand tangible collateral, and Jamal had nothing of real value. So he turned to the 2 people in this room foolish enough to tie their financial existence to a con artist. I slowly turned on the stage and locked eyes with my parents. Richard and Patricia were huddled together near the melting ice sculpture, looking like terrified children caught in a nightmare. My parents willingly liquidated their retirement accounts and sold off their valuable art collection, I announced, pointing directly at them. But instead of legally reporting that massive income to the Internal Revenue Service, they illegally funneled all of it into Jamal's Cayman Islands accounts to dodge capital gains taxes. They thought they could cheat the government and hide their wealth. But to get that $5 million loan, Jamal needed them to legally guarantee the debt. Richard tried to speak, but his mouth only opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. My mother was openly weeping, her heavy diamond necklace sparkling mockingly under the chandelier. They guaranteed the loan using this massive, sprawling estate. I continued my words, striking them like physical blows. But the offshore bank demanded even more security. So my parents did the unthinkable. They dug up an old college student loan application I signed over a decade ago. They digitally copied my signature and fraudulently pasted it onto the commercial loan guarantee. They illegally pledged a highly valuable commercial property held in a protected blind trust my grandfather left exclusively to me. They committed aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud against their own daughter just to keep this pathetic illusion alive. The ballroom was absolutely dead silent. The sheer magnitude of the criminal conspiracy had stunned the wealthy crowd into complete submission. I looked straight at my father, who was now trembling uncontrollably. "But you made one catastrophic miscalculation, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly serious tone. "You clearly did not bother to read the fine print of my grandfather's trust agreement. There is a very specific legal clause designed to protect the primary beneficiary from unauthorized encumbrances. If any party attempts to illegally leverage the trust property without my verifiable consent, I am granted immediate emergency power to seize absolute control of the trust and freeze all connected guarantor assets." I paused, letting the heavy silence amplify the devastating truth. "Yesterday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, I walked into the main branch of your primary domestic bank accompanied by my legal counsel," I revealed slowly. "I presented the irrefutable forensic proof of your forgery to the bank executives. Because your personal domestic accounts were legally tied to the fraudulent offshore loan guarantee, the bank immediately executed the protective clause. I have officially taken full administrative control of the blind trust. And more importantly, I have legally frozen every single one of your financial assets." Patricia let out a loud, agonizing wail that echoed terribly through the elegant room. Richard gripped his chest, his knees physically buckling beneath him. "Your checking accounts are locked," I declared mercilessly. "Your credit cards are completely declined. Your domestic investment portfolios are entirely frozen pending the federal investigation." You have zero access to your hidden Cayman accounts because those have already been flagged by the IRS Criminal Division. You cannot buy a cup of coffee tomorrow morning, Richard. You are completely broke. The empire of lies you built by stepping on my neck is officially dead. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. No one breathed. No one moved. Richard slumped heavily against the cocktail table, his face buried in his trembling hands. Patricia was weeping openly, her perfectly styled hair falling loosely around her face as her entire reality crumbled into dust. Amanda stood frozen, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, as if I had suddenly turned into a monster. But I was not the monster. I was just the mirror reflecting their own horrific actions back at them. The giant antique grandfather clock in the grand hallway began to chime. It was exactly 11:45 in the evening. There were just 15 minutes left until the new year. It was the absolute perfect time for a brutal, fresh start. Suddenly, the heavy velvet curtains covering the massive floor-to-ceiling windows were illuminated from the outside. It was not the soft, warm glow of garden lights or early celebratory fireworks. It was a violent, alternating flash of bright red and piercing blue. The frantic flashing lights bounced off the crystal chandeliers, casting strange, terrifying shadows across the pale faces of the wealthy guests. The rhythmic strobe effect completely transformed the elegant party into a chaotic nightmare. A loud, booming voice echoed from the front foyer, completely shattering the remaining silence. "Federal agents, nobody move! Stay exactly where you are," the commanding voice yelled. The heavy oak front doors were thrown open so violently they slammed against the interior walls with a deafening crack. A dozen men and women wearing dark tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers stormed into the grand foyer. The bright yellow letters printed boldly across their backs spelled out FBI and IRS criminal investigation. They moved with terrifying military precision, fanning out to secure every single exit in the massive house. The elegant New Year's Eve party instantly erupted into a scene of absolute mass hysteria. Wealthy socialites screamed in genuine terror, dropping their expensive crystal champagne flutes onto the marble floor. Local politicians desperately tried to cover their faces and back away from the center of the room, terrified of being photographed anywhere near a massive federal raid. The federal agents shouted commands demanding identification and ordering the panicked crowd to step away from the hosts. Jamal did not freeze. The sheer terror of spending decades in a federal penitentiary completely overrode his arrogant bravado. While all eyes were fixed on the heavily armed agents swarming the front entrance, Jamal slowly backed away from the melting ice sculpture. He completely abandoned Amanda, who was crying hysterically and clutching the skirt of her expensive dress. Jamal turned and sprinted blindly toward the massive glass doors leading out to the back patio and the expansive winter gardens. He shoved open the heavy glass doors, letting a brutal blast of freezing winter air blow into the warm ballroom. He honestly thought he could disappear into the dark, sprawling estate. He still arrogantly believed he was smarter than the federal government. But the FBI does not execute a massive raid on a multi-million-dollar financial criminal without fully securing the outer perimeter first. The very moment Jamal's expensive leather shoes hit the cold stone of the back patio, two dark figures emerged rapidly from the shadows of the manicured privacy hedges. Federal agents get down on the ground. A deep voice barked through the freezing night air. Jamal completely ignored the loud warning. He tried to dart sideways toward the covered swimming pool, hoping to vault the back fence, but he was not nearly fast enough. One of the federal agents lunges forward, wrapping his thick, muscular arms tightly around Jamal's waist. The sheer forward momentum carried them both hard onto the freezing concrete patio. Jamal's face violently smashed against the cold stone, busting his lip and completely ruining his custom velvet tuxedo jacket. "Stop resisting! Put your hands behind your back!" the agent yelled, pressing his heavy knee directly between Jamal's shoulder blades to pin him to the freezing ground. Jamal was sobbing now, a pathetic whimpering sound that carried clearly back into the warm ballroom. He thrashed wildly like a trapped animal, but a second federal agent quickly grabbed his flailing wrists and forcefully yanked them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the crisp winter night air. The supposed financial genius, the man who bragged about crushing my husband, was now just another common criminal crying face down in the dirt. Inside the lavish ballroom, the absolute chaos continued to unfold around us. David stood right beside me on the wooden stage, his strong hand resting securely on my lower back. We watched the entire dramatic scene unfold with absolute quiet calm. We did not run. We did not panic. We simply stood our ground and watched the toxic empire of lies completely collapse under the crushing and inevitable weight of federal justice. The lead federal agent raised his voice above the panicked murmurs. "If you are not a resident or a named suspect, you are ordered to leave immediately," he commanded, pointing toward the doors. The wealthy investors and politicians practically trampled each other in their desperate rush to escape the federal raid outside. Within minutes, the massive house emptied, leaving only the federal agents, my shattered family, and us standing in the wreckage. Richard managed to push himself up from the cocktail table. A desperate surge of his usual arrogant entitlement flared in his eyes. He adjusted his silk tie and marched toward the lead Internal Revenue Service agent. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling with fear and forced authority. "You have no right to storm into my home like wild animals. I am a highly respected man. I demand you release my son-in-law immediately and get off my private property before I call the governor." Patricia stepped up beside her husband, pointing a shaking manicured finger at the federal agent. "Do you know how much this estate is worth?" she shrieked hysterically. "We own this entire property. You are completely ruining our holiday celebration. Get out of my house right now." The lead agent did not blink at their ridiculous demands. He stared at Richard with the detached expression of a man who dealt with arrogant white-collar criminals every day. He slowly reached inside his navy windbreaker and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He handed the stack of papers directly to my father. "I strongly suggest you read the first page carefully, sir," the agent stated flatly. "This is an official federal seizure notice authorized by a judge. As of this exact moment, this entire property and all assets contained within it are under the direct legal control of the United States government." Richard snatched the papers from the agent's hand. His eyes darted frantically across the bold black text printed on the official federal letterhead. He shook his head in aggressive denial. "This is a massive mistake," Richard stammered, his voice cracking. "This house is fully paid off. It is completely mine. You cannot seize a private family home over a simple financial misunderstanding. My lawyers will have this order thrown out of court by tomorrow morning." I gently squeezed David's hand and slowly stepped down from the raised wooden stage. The heavy fabric of my emerald green silk gown brushed against the marble floor as I walked deliberately toward my parents. The federal agents recognized me immediately from the extensive whistleblower files I had submitted, and they respectfully stepped aside to let me pass. I stopped just a few feet away from my father. I looked at the man who had constantly belittled my intelligence and threatened to ruin my life just 24 hours ago. "You do not own this house anymore, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly steady and piercingly clear in the quiet room. "You used it as direct collateral for a fraudulent loan. Because you illegally forged my signature on the trust guarantee, the domestic bank completely canceled your entire line of credit. I personally made sure the bank executives reviewed the clear forensic evidence of your felony. The bank officially called the $5 million loan at exactly 5:00 this evening." Richard stared at me, his mouth hanging open in utter disbelief. The heavy federal seizure papers slipped through his trembling fingers and scattered loosely across the polished marble floor. Patricia let out a soft, horrifying gasp, her hands flying to cover her face, as the devastating reality finally crushed her delusions. "When you default on a loan of that magnitude backed by fraudulent documents, the bank moves instantly," I explained without a single ounce of sympathy. "They transferred the deed directly to the federal authorities as part of the criminal investigation. You do not have powerful lawyers coming to save you because your bank accounts are entirely frozen. You have absolutely nothing left in the world. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever personal clothing you can carry and vacate the premises. The ultimate mic drop hung heavily in the cold air. Richard physically collapsed, falling hard onto his knees amidst the scattered documents. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly like a broken child. Patricia collapsed right next to him, wailing hysterically into the empty ballroom. Amanda stood frozen in the corner, completely paralyzed by shock. I did not offer them a hand. I turned my back on the people who had always treated me like an outsider. David wrapped his arms securely around my shoulders, and we walked out the front doors together, leaving the ruins of their toxic empire completely behind us. 3 months later, the bitter winter chill had finally thawed, giving way to a bright and promising spring. I sat comfortably in a sleek leather chair inside the United States Attorney's office downtown. The room was sterile and intimidating to most people, but to me it felt like a sanctuary of absolute justice. Across the heavy mahogany desk sat lead prosecutor Thomas. He was a sharp, no-nonsense man who had spent the last 90 days meticulously dismantling the criminal network my family had so arrogantly built. He closed a thick manila folder and leaned back in his chair, offering me a rare, satisfied smile. "We officially finalized the plea agreement this morning," Rachel Prosecutor Thomas said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet office. "Jamal completely folded the second we presented the audio recordings, and your forensic analysis of the Delaware shell companies. He knew going to trial would result in a 20-year sentence. He agreed to plead guilty to federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and tax evasion. He is looking at a mandatory 10 years in a minimum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He will also be required to pay full restitution to the investors, though we both know he does not have a single penny left to his name." I nodded slowly, letting the immense weight of those words fully settle into my mind. 10 years. It was a massive chunk of his life completely gone. 10 years of wearing a prison uniform instead of custom velvet tuxedos. 10 years of being told exactly what to do and when to do it. His massive ego would be absolutely crushed within the very first week of his incarceration. Did he try to implicate my parents to secure a lighter sentence? I asked, resting my hands calmly in my lap. Prosecutor Thomas let out a short, dry laugh. "Of course he did," he replied, shaking his head. "There is absolutely no loyalty among thieves." He tried to throw Richard and Patricia right under the bus, claiming they orchestrated the entire offshore money laundering operation. But thanks to your incredibly thorough documentation, we knew Jamal was the primary architect. Your parents were simply his willing and greedy accomplices. Speaking of your family, the financial penalties the IRS levied against them have been fully executed as of yesterday afternoon. I leaned forward, slightly eager to hear the final outcome of my sister's fake luxury lifestyle, and Amanda I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "How is the golden child handling her sudden descent into absolute poverty?" Prosecutor Thomas opened a separate file and scanned the top page. "Her situation is legally catastrophic," he stated flatly. "Because she filed joint tax returns with Jamal and actively spent the stolen investor funds to build her online brand, the Internal Revenue Service held her completely liable for the unpaid taxes on that stolen income. Her social media influencer career is completely dead. The moment her followers found out she was funding her lavish lifestyle with stolen retirement money, she was universally canceled. Every single brand sponsor dropped her overnight. She tried to post a tearful apology video, claiming ignorance, but the internet was completely merciless. She was forced to declare total bankruptcy last month," Prosecutor Thomas continued. "The government seized all her designer clothing, her jewelry, and her luxury vehicles to help cover the restitution. She currently has a permanent federal tax lien attached to her Social Security number. We tracked her recent employment history for the garnishment paperwork. She is currently working 30 hours a week as a retail associate at a discount clothing store in the local mall." The IRS will automatically garnish 40% of her minimum wage paychecks for the rest of her natural life until the multi-million-dollar debt is fully satisfied. A profound sense of poetic justice washed over me. Amanda had spent her entire adult life mocking my career, looking down on my husband, and treating anyone who did not wear designer labels like absolute trash. Now she was folding cheap shirts for minimum wage while the federal government siphoned away her earnings. It is a fitting end, I said quietly, handing the federal document back across the heavy mahogany desk. They built their entire identity on the illusion of wealth and superiority. Now they have to face the real world without a safety net. Prosecutor Thomas nodded in solid agreement. You handed us the most comprehensive whistleblower package I have seen in my entire 20-year career, Rachel, he said seriously. You did a massive public service stopping that Ponzi scheme before it destroyed even more innocent families. You should be incredibly proud of yourself. I stood up and shook his hand, feeling a deep sense of complete closure. I walked out of the United States Attorney's office and stepped into the bright spring sunshine. The crisp air felt entirely different today. It felt like absolute freedom. I walked down the busy city sidewalk toward my parked car, letting the energetic sounds of the downtown traffic wash over me. My mind drifted from Jamal's 10-year federal prison sentence and Amanda's minimum wage retail job directly to the two people who had started this catastrophic mess. Richard and Patricia were currently learning the harshest lesson of their privileged lives. When your existence is built on the shallow foundation of perceived wealth, you have absolutely nothing left when the money finally disappears. The financial fallout for my parents was incredibly swift and utterly brutal. The federal government officially seized their massive, sprawling suburban estate just 48 hours after the New Year's Eve raid. They were forced to pack whatever basic clothing fit into a few small suitcases and leave the property forever under the direct supervision of heavily armed federal agents. Their sleek luxury cars were towed away on flatbed trucks to be auctioned off by the state. But the financial ruin was only the very beginning of their severe punishment. The societal execution was far more agonizing for them to actually endure. For decades, Richard and Patricia had treated their high society friends like the most important people on earth. But the very moment the massive financial scandal hit the local evening news, every single one of those fake friends completely vanished into thin air. The elite private country club where my father had spent half his adult life sent a formal legal letter via certified mail. The board of directors permanently revoked their exclusive membership, citing the massive public embarrassment and their suddenly unpaid monthly dues. My parents were officially blacklisted from every social circle they had ever desperately clawed their way into. They quickly discovered that nobody wants to associate with exposed federal criminals. The corrupt local politicians who happily drank their stolen champagne completely ignored their desperate phone calls. They were utterly alone in the cold, real world. I arrived back at my quiet, modest home and walked straight into the kitchen. David was standing at the stove cooking dinner, while Leo and Mia were happily doing their school homework at the granite island. Suddenly, my cell phone buzzed loudly against the hard kitchen counter. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I had not spoken a single word to him since the night of the dramatic federal raid. I did not pick up the phone. I just stood there, silently watching the screen light up until the incoming call finally rolled over to the automated voicemail. A minute later, the notification chimed. David turned down the heat on the stove and looked at me. I pressed the speaker button, placing the phone flat on the cool granite counter. My father's voice filled our warm, quiet kitchen, but it did not sound anything like the arrogant, demanding patriarch I had known my entire life. His voice was incredibly frail, shaking with raw desperation and total defeat. "Rachel, please pick up the phone," my father's recorded voice begged pitifully. "It is your dad. We are in so much terrible trouble. The government took absolutely everything we owned. We have been staying at a cheap, dirty roadside motel for the past 2 months, but our last credit card was just officially declined this morning. Your mother is very sick, and she will not stop crying in the dark. I know you are furious with us, but you are our only daughter left. Amanda cannot help us anymore. We just need a small personal loan. Just $2,000 to put down a security deposit on a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the east side of town. Please, Rachel, I am begging you on my hands and knees. We are so sorry for everything we did to you. Please call me back. The voicemail ended with a pathetic, trembling sob and a loud electronic click. Years ago, that manipulative plea would have sent me rushing to the bank to rescue them. I would have sacrificed my own peace just to earn a tiny scrap of their conditional love. But the insecure woman who desperately needed their approval died the exact moment they digitally forged my signature to steal my children's financial future. I looked down at my phone. I felt a brief fleeting twinge of basic human pity for two pathetic old people who had completely destroyed their own lives through pure greed. But I did not feel a single ounce of familial obligation. I picked up the phone and confidently pressed the delete button, permanently erasing the pathetic audio message from my life. Then I opened my contact settings. I clicked on Richard's name and pressed block caller. I did the exact same thing for Patricia. The digital block engaged silently and permanently. The toxic cord that had tied me to their abuse for 33 years was finally completely cut. It took nearly a full year for the massive federal bureaucracy to completely process the financial recovery from Jamal's massive fraud case. Life moved on beautifully and peacefully, without the constant dark shadow of my toxic parents hanging over our quiet home. The daily stress that once tightened my shoulders was completely gone. David received a highly deserved promotion to charge nurse at the pediatric clinic. Leo was now reading at the very top of his second-grade class, completely overcoming the mild dyslexia my mother had so cruelly mocked. Mia started kindergarten and made wonderful new friends instantly. We were thriving in the peaceful silence they left behind. One warm, sunny afternoon in late May, a postal worker knocked loudly on our front door. He was holding a thick, rigid priority envelope that required a direct signature. I signed his small electronic pad and carried the heavy envelope into the kitchen. The return address was printed clearly in bold black letters. It was from the United States Department of the Treasury Internal Revenue Service Whistleblower Office. David walked into the kitchen just as I was carefully slicing the top of the thick envelope open with a butter knife. My hands were actually shaking slightly as I pulled out a thick stack of official government documents. Tucked right behind the legal paperwork was a single piece of stiff security paper folded neatly in half. I opened the stiff paper and stared in absolute shock at the numbers printed across the official federal check. I ran my fingers gently over the raised watermark, verifying its complete authenticity. The United States government had successfully recovered the massive amount of stolen investor funds and the millions of dollars my parents had illegally hidden in their offshore accounts. Under federal law, I was legally entitled to a percentage of the total recovered tax assets. The official check in my hands was made out directly to me. The amount printed clearly on the federal check was exactly $450,000. I slowly handed the piece of paper to David. He looked at the massive number and had to sit down heavily on a wooden kitchen stool. It was more money than we had ever seen in our entire lives. It was not stolen money or dirty funds laundered through empty shell companies. It was a completely clean legal reward for exposing a massive criminal enterprise and protecting innocent investors. It felt like the ultimate cosmic compensation for the years of emotional abuse and financial theft I had endured at the hands of my own toxic family. We did not go out and buy luxury sports cars or expensive designer clothing like Amanda would have done. We sat down at the kitchen island that very night and made a solid, incredibly responsible financial plan. We knew exactly how to break the generational cycle of financial manipulation once and for all. The very next morning, we went straight to our local bank and opened 2 high-yield educational trust accounts. We deposited a massive portion of the federal reward money directly into those secure accounts. We ensured that Leo and Mia would have their future college tuition completely paid for in full. Nobody would ever be able to steal their educational future or hold their tuition hostage for manipulative leverage like my mother had done to me. With the remaining funds, we decided to invest in something tangible and deeply meaningful for our small family. We drove 3 hours north to a beautiful, pristine lake surrounded by towering green pine trees. We purchased a gorgeous rustic wooden cabin right on the exact edge of the crystal clear water. It had a massive wraparound wooden porch and a huge stone fireplace right in the center of the cozy living room. It was not a sprawling suburban mansion built on fraudulent loans and fake prestige. It was a genuine warm sanctuary, paid for entirely in clean cash. We spent our summer weekends painting the interior walls bright, cheerful colors and building a sturdy wooden dock for the kids to safely jump off. There were absolutely no expensive aesthetic rules or strict formal dress codes at our lake house. There were no judgmental whispers about David's noble nursing profession or Leo's learning pace. It was a safe, beautiful place where our children could just run wild and be completely free from the toxic expectations that had entirely defined my own miserable childhood. Every time I sat on that wooden porch, watching my incredible husband teach our son how to fish, I felt an overwhelming sense of absolute victory. The gift my family had intended to use as a weapon of humiliation had ultimately bought us our complete and total freedom forever. We were finally safe and completely happy. Sitting on that wooden porch, I often find myself reflecting on the profound journey that brought us here. Society constantly feeds us a very specific and dangerous narrative about family. From the time we are young children, we are conditioned to believe that blood is thicker than water. We are bombarded with movies and greeting cards telling us that family is absolutely everything, and that you must always forgive your relatives no matter what they do. We are told to turn the other cheek to keep the peace, and to swallow our own pain simply because the people hurting us happen to share our genetic makeup. For 33 years, I bought into that exact toxic myth. I allowed myself to be the designated punching bag for my parents and my sister, because I honestly believed that putting up with their relentless cruelty was simply the mandatory price of admission for having a family. But surviving their massive financial betrayal taught me a completely different truth. Sharing DNA with someone is nothing more than a random biological accident. It does not give anyone a lifetime free pass to continuously disrespect, manipulate, or abuse you. It certainly does not entitle them to secretly forge your signature and steal the financial security of your innocent children just to maintain their fake luxury aesthetic. True loyalty should never require you to sacrifice your own mental health or compromise your core values. When people show you exactly who they are through their repeated malicious actions, you have to find the courage to finally believe them. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but granting endless forgiveness to people who are absolutely not sorry is just handing them a freshly loaded weapon and inviting them to shoot you again. The hardest part of walking away from a toxic family is dealing with the intense guilt society tries to place on your shoulders. When people hear that I completely cut off my parents and my sister, they often look at me with judgment or pity. They assume I must be a cold or bitter person. They do not see the decades of emotional neglect, the constant mocking of my wonderful husband, or the cruel comments made about my young son's learning disability. They only see a daughter who walked away. But I no longer let the uninformed opinions of outsiders dictate my reality. The profound peace I feel when I wake up every single morning in our quiet home is all the validation I will ever need. I sleep soundly knowing that my children are completely safe from the vicious cycle of conditional love and narcissistic abuse that poisoned my own childhood. David and I are teaching Leo and Mia what real family actually means. We are showing them that family is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine honesty. Family is the group of people who celebrate your authentic victories, not the ones who try to sabotage your success to make themselves feel taller. Family is the husband who stands like a solid brick wall between you and a screaming con artist in a crowded ballroom. Family is the people who love you exactly as you are, without requiring you to buy expensive gifts or perform like a trained seal for their social media followers. We created our own beautiful family from the ground up, and it is entirely free of the toxic rot that infected my parents' mansion. Looking back at that fateful Christmas morning, I realize now that being excluded from their hollow gift exchange was actually the greatest blessing I could have ever received. It was the harsh wake-up call I desperately needed to finally open my eyes and take decisive action. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is taking out the trash. You have to be willing to burn down the fake bridges to build a real foundation for your future. I know many of you watching this are dealing with your own versions of Richard, Patricia, and Amanda. I know exactly how heavy that burden feels and how impossible it seems to finally walk away. But I am living proof that there is a beautiful, peaceful life waiting for you on the other side of that difficult choice. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family to protect your peace? Tell me your story in the comments. Let us build a supportive community where we remind each other that choosing your own mental health is never a selfish act. If you found strength in my story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content. Remember that your worth is never defined by the people who failed to love you properly. You always have the power to write your own beautiful ending.